It was the kind of neighborhood that looked perfect from the outside neatly trimmed lawns. Identical mailboxes, cul-de-sacs lined with SUVs and minivans, and houses painted in the exact 3 approved shades of beige. At first glance, everything screamed safe and peaceful. But behind the manicured hedges, there was something simmering in overreach of control that went far beyond a normal homeowner's association. The people who ran this HOA weren't just nosy neighbors with too much time on their hands. They acted like they owned the streets, as though the sidewalks were theirs to patrol and enforce. At the center of it all was the HOA board president, a man named Gerald, who seemed to believe he was the law incarnate. He wasn't satisfied with sending out letters about trash cans left visible or fines for grass being a quarter-inch too high. No, Gerald had gone further. He'd recruited a few equally power-hungry residents into what he liked to call the Neighborhood Enforcement Committee. The committee wore matching polo shirts with embroidered badges stitched on the chest and carried cheap radios clipped to their belts. They strutted up and down the block, pretending they were law enforcement. To anyone else, they looked ridiculous middle-aged neighbors, play-acting as police officers, but inside the HOA bubble. They were feared. Residents avoided conflict with them because they knew the committee would retaliate with fines, violation notices, or worse, petty harassment. It was in this over-controlled neighborhood that the Henderson family lived. They had moved in a few years earlier, lured by the schools and quiet streets, never imagining the tangled mess of HOA politics they'd be pulled into. Mrs. Henderson, Elise, wasn't just any suburban mom. She was the district attorney for the county, a woman used to seeing power misused, manipulated, and abused in court. She recognized the HOA's antics for what they were: intimidation without legal authority. Still, Elise kept her head down, paying dues, avoiding confrontation, and focusing on her work. She thought that, as long as her family stayed under the radar, the so-called enforcers would leave them alone. But that fragile balance shattered one evening when her teenage son, Ryan, was simply walking home. Ryan was 16, lanky and tired. From a long afternoon of basketball at the park just outside the neighborhood gates, the sun was setting as he strolled back, earbuds in, backpack slung across his shoulder. He wasn't doing anything wrong, just heading home on the sidewalk, the same way he had dozens of times before. But to the self-proclaimed HOA cops, this was an opportunity. They'd been waiting for a chance to make a statement, to flex their authority in front of the neighbors. And in their twisted minds, a teenager walking home after dark was enough to justify an intervention. Gerald and 2 of his committee members pulled up in a golf cart outfitted with flashing yellow lights. They parked diagonally across the sidewalk to block Ryan's path. Before he could react, they were surrounding him, puffing out their chests, speaking in voices they must have thought sounded official. To Ryan, it was surreal. He thought they were joking at first, until one of them grabbed his backpack strap and barked at him to stop resisting. Within minutes, the fake cops had escalated what should have been nothing into something dangerous. They claimed he was trespassing, that he was loitering after community hours, and even accused him of suspicious activity. Ryan, confused and frightened, tried to explain he lived there, that he was walking to his own house. But they didn't care. This was about power. This was about sending a message to the whole neighborhood, that no one was beyond their reach. Some whispered to each other, watching in disbelief as the men actually put Ryan in plastic, zip-tie cuffs, and marched him toward the golf cart like he was a criminal. A few pulled out their phones to record, unsure if this was a prank, a misunderstanding, or something far worse. By the time Elise's phone rang, her son was already sitting in the back of the golf cart, hands restrained, panic in his eyes. A neighbor who witnessed everything called her, their voice frantic, telling her that the HOA police had just arrested her boy. At first, Elise thought it had to be an exaggeration, but when she heard the fear in her neighbor's tone, she knew it was real. She didn't panic. Years in the courtroom had trained her to stay calm under pressure. But beneath that calm was something burning hotter than anger: resolve. Elise Henderson was a prosecutor, sworn to uphold the law. And if the HOA thought they could play at being cops, they were about to learn what real authority looked like. She grabbed her keys, her badge, and headed straight for the scene. As she drove through the neighborhood streets, Elise could see the spectacle unfolding ahead, the golf cart with its yellow lights still blinking. the committee members posturing like security guards, and her son sitting there as though he were some dangerous suspect. She parked, stepped out, and walked toward them with a presence that turned heads. The air shifted. Everyone watching seemed to sense that something big was about to happen. But before anything else could unfold, before Elise made her move, the HOA enforcers realized who they were dealing with. The entire situation balanced on the edge of a knife. And that's where the real fight began. The moment Elise stepped onto the sidewalk, the balance of power shifted, though the HOA enforcers didn't realize it yet. They still stood tall, puffing out their chests as if they were real officers, convinced that their golf cart patrol and plastic zip ties gave them authority. To them, Elise was just another neighborhood mom coming to complain. They didn't know that she was the county's district attorney, a woman who spent her days dismantling cases of unlawful detainment and prosecuting those who dared to take the law into their own hands. She scanned the scene in an instant. Her son Ryan was seated rigidly in the golf cart, his hands bound in zip ties, his face pale and tight with fear. Gerald, the self-proclaimed president and ringleader of this farce, stood with his arms crossed, projecting smug satisfaction. His two sidekicks flanked him, one gripping a cheap flashlight like a baton, the other holding a clipboard filled with incident reports that looked like something downloaded from the internet. Neighbors lingered on lawns and porches, whispering, filming on their phones, waiting to see how it would play out. The entire neighborhood felt caught in suspended silence. Like the pause between thunder and lightning, Elise walked forward slowly, with the same measured steps she used when approaching a jury box. Her eyes never left Gerald, and her calmness, they seemed to rattle him more than shouting ever could. He opened his mouth, ready to deliver some overblown explanation about community safety protocols. But Elise raised her hand slightly, not in panic, not in surrender, but in authority. He hesitated. For the first time, he looked unsure. Elise's presence carried the weight of something far beyond the neighborhood. She radiated the kind of certainty that came from years of commanding courtrooms, facing down hardened criminals, and arguing in front of judges. She knew the law, and unlike Gerald and his crew, she didn't have to pretend. She approached the golf cart and examined the plastic cuffs digging into her son's wrists. Each second she looked at them only fueled her resolve. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to threaten. The truth of the situation was enough to strip away the thin veneer of authority these men clung to. She leaned close. Enough for Ryan to hear her voice, steady and quiet, reminding him without words that he wasn't alone anymore. He lifted his eyes, relief flashing across his face. The fear in his posture softened, replaced by trust in the woman who had fought battles far larger than this. Gerald cleared his throat, fumbling for control of the moment. He tried to explain himself loudly enough for the neighbors to hear, spouting phrases about community safety and rules enforcement. His tone was meant to sound commanding, but it carried the desperate edge of a man who realized he was losing his grip. His two companions shifted uncomfortably, darting glances at each other, as though silently asking if this had gone too far. Elise didn't argue with him. She didn't validate his authority with debate. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out her identification, her district attorney badge. The metal caught the fading light of dusk, glinting like a blade. She held it at chest height, perfectly still, letting the weight of what it represented settle over everyone present. The reaction was instant. Gasps rippled through the crowd of watching neighbors. Gerald's smug expression faltered, the color draining from his face. His henchmen froze, their bravado evaporating as they realized they weren't facing a typical angry parent but the highest prosecutorial authority in the county. The cameras in neighbors' hands zoomed closer. Capturing every second, Elise's eyes didn't leave Gerald's, without a single raised word. She communicated what he hadn't yet grasped. This wasn't just neighborhood politics anymore. This was unlawful detention. This was impersonation of law enforcement. This was criminal. She stepped toward the golf cart, cutting the zip ties with a pocket tool she carried, freeing her son with deliberate precision. The snap of the plastic echoed in the air like a gavel striking wood. Ryan rubbed his wrists, watching his mother dismantle the false authority that had held him moments earlier. Gerald stammered, searching for words to regain footing. He claimed that Ryan had been wandering suspiciously, that they were protecting. the community, but the excuses crumbled under the weight of the truth. Elise finally spoke, not in anger, but with the measured tone of someone stating undeniable facts. She reminded them, in front of the entire neighborhood, that they had no authority to detain anyone, that their golf cart badges and radios meant nothing, that placing a minor in restraints without cause was a criminal act. And she emphasized for every recording phone to hear that this would not be overlooked. The silence after her words was heavy. Gerald's sidekicks shifted visibly. Uncomfortable, no longer sure they wanted to be aligned with him. The neighbors watched, some nodding in quiet agreement, others simply stunned. The myth of the HOA police had shattered in seconds. But Elise wasn't done. She pulled out her phone and made a call, her voice calm but clear, summoning real law enforcement to the scene. Gerald tried to protest, his voice cracking as he insisted they had only been doing their duty. But it was too late. The authority he'd built on intimidation and theatrics had collapsed in front of an audience. Within minutes, the flashing lights of actual police cruisers illuminated the cul-de-sac, replacing the weak yellow glow of the HOA's golf cart beacon. Officers stepped out, their presence starkly contrasting the farce that had played out earlier. Neighbors leaned in closer, eager to see what would happen next. The police took statements from witnesses, from Elise, from Ryan. Phones were handed over, video shown. The evidence was undeniable. Gerald and his committee had unlawfully restrained. A teenager impersonated officers and attempted to justify it under the guise of HOA authority. The officers turned to Gerald and his companions, their faces drained of color as handcuffs clicked, not the cheap plastic kind, but the real steel that carried consequences. The neighborhood that once cowered under their control now watched them led toward squad cars, their posturing stripped. Away, for Elise, it wasn't victory she felt, but something sharper. This wasn't over. She knew the legal process was only beginning, and she would be at the center of ensuring it reached its rightful conclusion. Her son was safe, but the larger question remained: how had the HOA been allowed to spiral this far into dangerous delusion? As the squad cars pulled away, carrying Gerald and his cronies into the night, Elise placed a hand on Ryan's shoulder and walked him home. Neighbors whispered, filmed, and speculated. But Elise's focus was on the steps ahead. Because tonight had been about her son, but tomorrow would be about dismantling the entire rotten system that had allowed this to happen. And with that, the battle lines were drawn. The morning after the arrests, the neighborhood didn't feel the same. It wasn't just the lingering tension from the flashing police lights the night before, or the memory of seeing their HOA president hauled off in handcuffs. It was the atmosphere, that sudden collapse of authority that had, for years, held everyone in a quiet grip of fear. For the first time in a long time, residents left their blinds open instead of peeking from behind them. Conversations spilled across driveways instead of being whispered in hushed tones. People compared notes, shared the videos they'd taken, and pieced together the truth. The so-called HOA Enforcement Committee hadn't just crossed a line, they had bulldozed right through it. The videos spread fast. Within hours, clips of Gerald and his crew zip-tying a teenager were circulating in neighborhood group chats, local Facebook pages, and eventually spilling out into wider online circles. The sight of grown men in golf carts pretending to be police officers was absurd enough to spark outrage. But pairing that absurdity with the reality of a frightened 16-year-old being restrained made it all the more damning. Neighbors who once shrugged off the committee's antics now saw them for what they really were: dangerous. The little infractions, the fines for trash cans, the citations for mismatched shutters, the warnings for cracked sidewalks suddenly looked less like community standards and more like tools of intimidation. The illusion of authority had been stripped bare, but with that exposure came unease. If the committee had been allowed to get away with this much, how deep did the rot go? Who else on the HOA board knew? Who quietly encouraged it? Who benefited from the culture of fear? Elise knew these questions were coming, and she also knew the answers wouldn't be simple. As district attorney, she had a front-row seat to how power twisted itself into self-preservation. The arrests were only the first step. Gerald and his enforcers would face charges impersonation of law enforcement, unlawful detention, possibly even child endangerment. But the HOA structure itself, the mechanism that had allowed them to masquerade as a police force was still intact. That morning, Elise sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Ryan sat across from her, his wrists still showing faint red marks from the zip ties. He was quieter than usual, his usual teenage sarcasm replaced with a solemn focus. The night before had shaken him deeply. But Elise knew her son, and she knew this wouldn't break him. If anything, it would harden his resolve to call out injustice when he saw it. Ryan's silence said everything. This wasn't just about Gerald. This was about a system that had turned neighbors against each other, creating an environment where bullying was disguised as governance. Elise understood that as much as she wanted to shield her son, she couldn't erase what had happened. What she could do was ensure it didn't happen to anyone else. By noon, the official fallout had begun. The local news station ran the story, using the neighbors' video footage. Anchors spoke gravely about the dangers of fake police forces and HOA overreach. Legal experts weighed in, all echoing the same point. These men had no authority, and their actions were criminal. The words lawsuit and criminal liability punctuated every segment. For the HOA board members who hadn't been arrested, the pressure mounted instantly. Their inboxes filled with angry emails. Their phones rang nonstop. Residents demanded an emergency meeting. Some called for the entire board to resign. Others wanted reassurance that such a disaster could never happen again. The board, long used to operating unchecked, suddenly found themselves under a microscope. And at the center of that scrutiny was Elise. As district attorney and as a resident, her voice carried more weight than anyone else's, and she knew the board feared her not just because of her title, but because she had already proven she wasn't afraid to act. That evening, the HOA held a hastily arranged town hall at the community center. The parking lot overflowed with cars, the hall packed shoulder to shoulder with angry residents. For years, attendance at HOA meetings had been sparse, with most people too intimidated or too apathetic to show up. But now, the room buzzed with restless energy, dozens of cell phones ready to record. The board members sat at their folding table on stage, shuffling papers and avoiding eye contact. The absence of Gerald and his committee was glaring. In their place sat pale, nervous faces, trying to spin the narrative. They insisted the board hadn't authorized the arrests, that Gerald had acted alone, that they were shocked and deeply concerned. But the crowd wasn't buying it. Residents stood up, one after another, voices sharp with outrage. They recounted stories of harassment, of threats, of arbitrary fines that piled up until people felt forced into compliance. They demanded accountability, demanded answers, demanded change. And then Elise rose to speak. The room hushed instantly. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her reputation preceded her. She spoke of law, of rights, of the limits of authority. She reminded everyone that a homeowners association was not a government, not a police force, not a court of law. It was a collective, bound by contracts, not criminal codes. Her words carried more than anger. They carried certainty. She told the board, in front of the entire neighborhood, that their actions would not go unexamined, that she would personally oversee the criminal proceedings against Gerald and his enforcers, that she would push for transparency in every decision that had led to this abuse of power. The board squirmed. The residents cheered. The illusion of control the board once held had been dismantled in a single evening, but Elise knew this was only the beginning. A wounded system rarely went quietly. Already, whispers circulated that some board members were seeking legal counsel, preparing to fight back. Some residents worried that Gerald, despite his arrest, still held sway behind the scenes, and others, the ones who had benefited from the committee's intimidation, muttered about outsiders, ruining the neighborhood's order. The battle lines were no longer just between Elise and Gerald. It was between those who wanted a community free from fear and those who clung to the fragile power the HOA had given them. As Elise walked home with Ryan that night, the air buzzed with possibility. Change was coming, but so was resistance. And Elise knew from experience that the most dangerous people were the ones who felt their power slipping through their fingers. The HOA war had only just begun. For a few days after the arrests and the fiery town hall, the neighborhood breathed easier. The golf cart patrols disappeared, the obnoxious violation notices stopped appearing on doorsteps, and the board members who hadn't been arrested stayed quiet, almost invisible. It felt, for the first time in years, like the grip of the HOA's manufactured authority had loosened. But in communities like this, silence never lasts long. Power doesn't fade away without a fight it claws back, desperate to reassert control. And that's exactly what happened. The retaliation didn't come with flashing lights or zip-tie cuffs. It came in quieter, subtler ways, slipped into the daily lives of residents like poison in water. Trash collection suddenly became delayed on Elise's street. Her mailbox, once pristine, was mysteriously dented overnight. Letters from the HOA citing newly discovered violations began arriving, claims about decorative plants being non-compliant, a barely visible crack in the driveway. It was petty, it was obvious, and it was deliberate. Elise wasn't surprised. She'd prosecuted enough cases to recognize retaliation when she saw it. But she hadn't expected the board to be so brazen, so willing to double down when the entire neighborhood had witnessed their corruption unravel. It was as though the arrests had only hardened their resolve. Pushing them into survival mode, neighbors began whispering again not about Gerald this time, but about the remnants of his influence. Some swore they saw his wife attending secret board meetings. Others claimed he was still directing things from outside, pulling strings through loyal allies. The idea wasn't far-fetched. Power, once tasted, rarely released its hold easily. Ryan, still shaken from the ordeal, became more observant than ever. He noticed the unfamiliar car parked at the end of their street at night, headlights off, engine idling. He spotted the same two HOA loyalist men who hadn't been arrested but were known for their loyalty to Gerald standing on corners. Watching him walk home, what had once been normal teenage freedom now carried a shadow of unease. Elise documented everything, every letter, every mysterious delay, every unwanted shadow trailing her family. She knew this was no longer about enforcing community standards. This was intimidation, pure and simple. And she was building a case brick by brick. But the board wasn't just targeting Elise. Other residents who had spoken out at the town hall found themselves facing similar harassment. One family received a $500 fine for having their car parked facing the wrong direction. Another discovered their water shut off due to a clerical error. A woman who had testified in Ryan's defense found a foreclosure warning letter. Slipped into her mailbox, though later, the HOA claimed it was a mistake. These weren't mistakes. They were warnings. The board was sending a message: fight us, and you'll pay. Still, the neighborhood had changed. Before, fear had kept people isolated, each family dealing with their own fines and harassment, in silence. Now residents compared notes, shared screenshots, and organized group chats. Every act of retaliation only fueled the growing sense of rebellion. The HOA had underestimated how much the community had shifted. For Elise, the retaliation wasn't just personal, it was professional. She knew the legal system moved slowly, bogged down by procedure and red tape. Gerald and his cronies might eventually face justice in court, but the board's everyday harassment required immediate counteraction. So, Elise began working on a different front. She reached out to state regulators, filing formal complaints about the HOA's practices. She contacted journalists who had covered the initial arrests, feeding them new stories of retaliation. And, most importantly, she quietly connected with residents to explore the nuclear option, dissolving the HOA entirely. It was a dangerous idea, one that carried risk and legal complexity. But for the first time, it seemed possible. The board, sensing Elise's moves, grew bolder in their retaliation. One evening, Ryan was walking home again when the familiar glow of a golf cart appeared behind him. It wasn't Gerald this time, but two of his old committee members, still wearing their knockoff uniforms, still clinging to the scraps of their imaginary authority. They didn't grab him this time. Instead, they followed slowly, headlights glaring, their radios crackling with static as they muttered into them like real officers. Ryan walked faster, heart pounding, until he reached his driveway. The golf cart stopped at the edge, engines humming, as if daring him to react. Elise stood at the door watching the entire thing unfold. She didn't rush to confront them, not yet. Instead, she pulled out her phone and recorded everything. Evidence. Always evidence. The following morning, she filed a restraining order against the men, naming her son as the protected party. She also sent copies of the video to the prosecutor's office, not her own office, but in neighboring counties, to avoid conflicts of interest. She knew the legal machine was slow, but she was tightening the noose. The board didn't know when to stop. Days later, a letter arrived on Elise's doorstep, claiming her family was in violation of community standards for publicly disparaging the HOA and threatening fines and potential lien actions. It was Lafablon, HOA, attempting to penalize a resident for speaking out. But Elise saw it for what it was: desperation. By now the neighborhood was fully awake. Residents packed another emergency meeting, this time not just to yell, but to act. Petitions circulated, calling for a vote to recall the remaining board members. Volunteers stepped forward to run for new positions. Lawyers among the residents offered free counsel. What had started as one mother defending her son had grown into a full-fledged movement. The board tried to fight back. They attempted to cancel the meeting, claiming procedural violations. They locked residents out of the community center, forcing the gathering onto someone's lawn. But the crowd came anyway, bringing chairs, signs, and determination. As Elise stood among them, she knew the battle was reaching its peak. Gerald and his cronies were out on bail, their trials looming. The board was splintering, its authority crumbling. And yet, the retaliation showed how dangerous they still were. The fight was no longer about one incident or one family. It was about whether a community could take back control from those who abused it. And as the night ended with chants of recall, echoing across the cul-de-sac, Elise knew one thing with absolute certainty: the HOA's reign of intimidation was nearing its end. But endings are rarely clean, and she also knew the board and Gerald would not go quietly. The weeks that followed were tense. The neighborhood teetered between newfound empowerment and the lingering threat of retaliation. Gerald and his committee, though under criminal indictment, were out on bail, moving like shadows behind the scenes. His allies on the board grew louder, desperate to protect what little control they had left. And the residents, fueled by outrage and solidarity, prepared for the ultimate confrontation: the recall vote that would decide the HOA's fate. The recall wasn't just about removing board members. It was about ending years of intimidation, years of fines disguised as governance, years of neighbors living in fear of golf carts and fake citations. For the residents, it was liberation. For the board, it was survival. The lead-up to the vote turned the community into a battleground. Flyers appeared in mailboxes, some urging residents to support the recall, others warning that, without the board's guidance, property values would plummet. Social media groups exploded with debate, with Gerald's loyalists painting Elise as a power-hungry DA using her position to dismantle the neighborhood. Elise ignored the slander. She knew distractions were all the board had left. On the day of the vote, the community center parking lot overflowed. Cars lined the streets, residents carrying clipboards, petitions, and cell phones. Local reporters arrived, cameras rolling, drawn by the drama that had already captivated the wider county. This wasn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. It was a spectacle, a test case for HOA overreach. Inside, the air was thick with tension. The board members sat stiffly at their table, eyes darting between the crowd and the cameras. Gerald wasn't officially allowed to attend, given his pending charges, but whispers confirmed he was watching from a car parked just outside his. Wife sat near the front, arms crossed, scowling at anyone who dared to speak against him. Elise sat among the residents.com, but unyielding. She wasn't here as district attorney. She was here as a mother, as a neighbor, as a woman who had watched her child zip-tied by imposters claiming authority. That memory still burned in her mind, fueling her resolve. The meeting began with the board attempting to maintain control. They droned on about rules of order, about procedural issues that supposedly invalidated the recall. But the crowd wasn't having it. They shouted them down, demanded the vote proceed, and reminded them that every word was being filmed. When Elise rose to speak, the room fell silent. She didn't grandstand. She didn't shout. Instead, she told the story of her son, of how he was detained, humiliated, and treated like a criminal in his own neighborhood. She described the retaliation, the intimidation, the harassment, not only against her family, but against every family who dared to resist. She reminded them all that authority without accountability was nothing but tyranny dressed in paperwork. Her words carried through the room, firm and steady, leaving no space for rebuttal. The residents erupted into applause, their voices rising. In unity, the board members paled, their once smug expressions replaced with fear. Then came the vote. Ballots were cast, counted in plain sight. Neighbors leaned forward, breath held, as the numbers were tallied. The result was overwhelming. The recall passed by a landslide. The board was dissolved. Cheers shook the room. Strangers hugged, children laughed, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt free. But the victory, sweet as it was, wasn't. The end, as the residents poured out of the community center, they found Gerald waiting in the shadows of his car, his face twisted with fury, his wife at his side, shouting that the neighborhood would regret this. His words fell flat. No one feared him anymore. The cameras caught every second. His ranting broadcast across local news that night, cementing his downfall. The weeks that followed brought closure. Gerald and his enforcers were convicted impersonating officers, unlawful detention, harassment, fines, probation, even short jail stints followed. The once feared committee dissolved. Into disgrace, the HOA, under new leadership elected by the residents themselves, stripped back its powers. No more arbitrary fines, no more secret patrols, no more intimidation. The golf carts, once symbols of fear, were parked permanently in garages, gathering dust. The community shifted from control to cooperation, residents working together instead of against one another. For Elise and Ryan, life slowly returned to normal. The red marks on his wrists faded, though the memory remained. But that memory, painful as it was, became the spark for something greater. Ryan grew more outspoken, volunteering at community events, reminding people of what they had overcome. Elise, though she rarely mentioned the ordeal in her professional life, carried it as a reminder that injustice doesn't always wear the face of hardened criminals. It can wear polo shirts and drive golf carts. And in the quiet that followed, the neighborhood found peace. The lawns were still trimmed, the mailboxes still uniform, the houses still beige, but something deeper had changed. The fear was gone. The illusion of authority had been shattered. The story of the fake HOA cops spread far beyond the cul-de-sac. It became a cautionary tale, a viral video, a reminder that unchecked power, no matter how small, can grow into something dangerous if left unchallenged. And at the center of it all was a mother who refused to back down, who turned the tables on those who thought they could control her family. In the end, Gerald and his crew learned the harshest truth of all. When you pretend to be the law, eventually, the real law comes knocking, and this time it knocked harder than they ever imagined.